So, we have an alteration in the order of the speakers this afternoon because Hazel Conway is not feeling well. She's got a bad throat. And so we are going to ask her to speak now so that she doesn't have to stay on to the very end. And it's extremely good of her to come at all. Hazel is the author of People's Parks. She's also a member, or she chairs, the Garden History Society's Conservation Committee and is a member of the English Heritage Parks and Gardens Committee. So she's a very authoritative lady and is now going to talk to us on, what is the title of yours? Victorian Park Buildings is your subject. Good. So let us welcome Hazel.
Thank you, Ted, and I apologize in advance for if I suddenly start croaking even worse. Recently, I attended a cultural detailing event. The occasion was a celebration of the opening in Hyde Park of the Crystal Palace on the 1st of May, 1851, which you see before you. First of all, the front facade was marked out by a white line marking machine, not a very straight one, I hasten to say, the sort of thing used to mark out football pitches. The plan was to mark out the whole of the building, but it was being filmed from the top of the Hilton Hotel, and this was the only part visible because trees happened to have grown up in the way. We then went on to see one corner of the building being reconstructed, as you can see on the right, but not in the actual position of one of the original corners because of the park uses today. 3 columns were erected to the exact profile of the original, the glazing bars, and then the glass was inserted. And finally, there was champagne all round, by which time I'm afraid I had left. The event was filmed by the BBC, and it will be shown on television in the autumn. And the aim of this reconstruction and the film about it has much to do with the subject of this conference, because it's about the continuing presence of the past, sometimes of the actual building, or sometimes just of parts of it, or sometimes, as in this case, of a building that no longer exists. But whether it survives or not, the question is, how do we engage with the past? How do we evaluate it? How do we interpret the quality of historical experience and the contribution of historic buildings, whether physically present or long gone, to local distinctiveness? So what I want to do now is to look at some of the issues that are being raised by the conservation of a variety of park buildings, and I include in that statues and monuments. To date, there are 57 park buildings on the English Heritage Buildings at Risk Register. But of course, in practice, there are very many more than that are in a very fragile condition. If you can't hear me, please wave your hand and I'll speak up. It was People's Park, Halifax, Paxton and Milner Park, which became an icon for park design decline in the 1990s. This image that you see on the left of green painted plywood boxes which protected the statues on the terrace from further vandalism, summed up the dire state of our public parks. People's Park has now been restored, and the statues on the terrace, which are copies, or were, still are, copies of classical originals, include Hercules, Venus, Diana, and Telemachus, and a Neapolitan music girl, seen on the right. They have been stabilized rather than restored, the graffiti removed, but the missing parts will not be replaced. There are still problems with the water features in this park. Originally, the water was not recycled, but it is now, and the installation of a recycling system has meant that it's difficult to balance the water in various pools. On the left, you see the lake, one of the lakes, before restoration, taken in the mid-1980s, and this is 2001, with the new boundary to the lake. The bandstand had a felt tiled roof on the left, and this has been replaced by a new zinc roof with the correct profile and cast iron detailing. On the terrace, in the central area, is a statue of Sir Francis Crossley, the donor of People's Park. He still sits in a niche under the arch in the centre of the terrace. Originally behind one set of bars, he is now behind a second set of bars, the most recent being grills on the archway, which can be secured at night and raised in the daytime. Much of the vandalism in this park was due to underuse. Encouraging greater use has been partly addressed by installing a children's playground, which was not part of the original Paxton Milner design. This attracts visitors and families and children are also involved in various park-based activities. I show you them with their bird boxes on the right-hand side. There's also a small new visitor centre and toilets. And in addition, there's on-site maintenance, somebody there 5 days a week, a warden and CCTV. I come now to Birkenhead Park. The Grand Lodge in Birkenhead Park, Paxton's first public park, 1847, marks the main entrance. On either side of it are lodges, here and here. Originally, they provided accommodation for porters, a role that has long since become redundant. One side is now used for commercial premises and architectural practice, and proposals were put forward for using the other side for local authority meetings, small ones, I guess, and to establish an archive there based on material formerly housed in the town hall of Birkenhead. Excuse me. These could then be consulted by the public. However, there is no disabled access to the building, and it is too small to provide any. There may, however, be a way around this. A new pavilion is being built on one side of Birkenhead Park, and if a van can be provided, this could take relevant archive material from the lodge to the new pavilion, which will have proper disabled access. There's a similar problem with the building on the right-hand slide. This is the Pump House in Battersea Park, now used as an art gallery and very popular, but there is no disabled access, and like the Grand Lodge at Birkenhead Park, the building is too small for any to be provided. I think, could we focus that a little bit, please? Thank you. In Birkenhead Park, the wooden Swiss bridge has survived since 1847. This is a slide taken from the mid-80s. In 1970, the bridge was isolated from the mainland for its own protection. This meant the removal of large quantities of earth and its dispersal. Subsequently, the vegetation grew up around the bridge to such an extent that it became inaccessible even from the island. This is what you can see now. The bridge is now disintegrating. It was intended to provide important views of Birkenhead Park. But if this function is restored and access is made possible, then there's a risk of vandalism and the bridge being burnt down. Most of the local population don't want it reconnected to the mainland for fear of arson. Furthermore, reconnecting it would imply either major earth moving again or the building of an additional bridge to span the gap. So what is to be done, and is there a right answer? One option is to take the bridge down completely and relocate it where it can be preserved safely, then rebuild a replica to the original design, but using fireproof materials. Another would be to re-establish the link to the mainland, but fence the bridge off so that it is only accessible on special occasions. Another would be to retain the bridge and treat it with fireproofing and install CCTV and let it take its chance. If this option is chosen, then full details need, of course, to be recorded, and then if it does get burnt down, it could be rebuilt to the original specification. Education and understanding are important elements in securing its future, and the Friends of Birkenhead Park are working on a website which will supply images of the park and of the Swiss Bridge and explore its significance. The Swiss Bridge also forms part of a key stage in the national curriculum for local children, so there is community involvement at a variety of levels. It was one of a number of bridges in Birkenhead Park which have subsequently vanished, as has the pagoda. On the left is the Chinese bridge, and on the right a rustic bridge. And this raises the whole question of reinstatement. What should be reinstated and how should it be justified? The park building, which seems to be most vulnerable to arson, is not the small-scale shelters, but toilets, and which are even more vulnerable. And the recent trend has been to convert toilets into cafes. There are numerous examples around the place. In Richmond Terrace Gardens, there's a lovely 1930s neoclassical toilet, long since boarded up, and it's hoped that this will be transformed into an art gallery. I think the left-hand one could again be refocused a little, please. I want to now come to the question of moving buildings and statues. The Dalton Fountain was the largest terracotta statue in the world at the time of the World Exhibition for which it was built, which was held in Kelvin Grove Park in Glasgow, where it stood originally. Subsequently, it was moved to a prominent position on Glasgow Green, where it formed a focal point in the flat landscape. Its subject, as you can see, is Queen Victoria ruling over her empire. At the top is the Queen wearing the imperial crown and carrying an orb and sceptre. Above the lowest basin are 4 groups representing the dominions, India, Africa, Canada and Australia, showing the main resources of each country. And above them, in the central portion, are the figures of a sailor and of Scots, Irish and English soldiers. The iconography, in other words, is of the economic contributions of the empire and the power of the British Army and Navy. The Doulton Monument survived until the mid-1980s, but is now, as you can see, in a very sad condition. It is to be restored, but as terracotta is such a fragile material, the statue will be moved to a new location near to the People's Palace, where CCTV will keep an eye on it. Work on the restoration of Glasgow Green has been delayed and costs seriously increased by the discovery of air raid shelters and slit trenches under the main events area. Records have been made of them and they've been reburied. A lido was also partially excavated. It was never completed when it was built in the 1930s, but then it was backfilled with toxic waste, which has all had to be removed, and this has all added severely to the cost of the restoration. The restoration of the Doulton Fountain and that of many statues and monuments in our parks raises many issues. We no longer live in a heroic age, and the heroes and heroines of the past are often the target of vandalism, yet they are an important part of our history. Ken Livingstone wants to remove what he sees as irrelevant figures, such as that of Sir Henry Havelock from Trafalgar Square. On the right you see Sir Henry Havelock in Mowbray Park, Sunderland. In the past, these statues were presented as figures to be revered and commemorated, but how can they be understood today? In the past, history tended to be from one viewpoint, that of the dominant elite. Understandably, many people felt excluded from it and found it irrelevant to their lives. It was not their history. Increasingly, we recognize that there are many histories, and parks have a very positive role to play in exploring them. Shelters are often charming buildings which add to the local character of a park, but they can be a problem, particularly if they become a home for homeless people or a focus for drinking, drugs or whatever other antisocial activities, because then other park visitors perceive them as no-go areas. On the left is a shelter in Sefton Park, Liverpool. The right, a shelter in Ipswich Arboretum. In Battersea Park, there are 5 shelters, none of them on the original plan. 2 of them are timber buildings with timber shingles dating from 1897. Subsequently, they were moved to new ad hoc positions, where they are now in the way and in conflict with the historic restoration. The problem is not easily resolved, for the original site of one of them now has something else on it, and there is nowhere else for the shelter to go. What to do? In many parks, efforts are being made to reduce the amount of traffic within the boundaries. In Battersea Park, the park police are located in the centre of the park just off the main drive that you saw in the first lecture with the bandstand. The relocation of the police to the periphery would mean that this area could be brought back to a use more in keeping with the original design, and in so doing, park traffic would be reduced. One of the options is to relocate the police to the maintenance yard, which has an excellent group of small-scale 19th century buildings. But this area is served by a very small access road, and it's used by large lorries carrying loads of plants and manure and stuff, and by maintenance staff. In order to manage the additional traffic that relocation of the police would bring, an extra road would be required, but the agreed policy is that there should be no increase in the area of roads in the park, and the problem still has to be resolved. In some parks, buildings intended as temporary have survived, and the problem is then what to do with them. Excuse me. The pleasure gardens built in Battersea Park in 1951, which you see some delightful picture postcards from, were designed as an outdoor stage set and never intended to last. The structures that remain are now in a dreadful condition, for walls were built without movement joints and major cracks have developed. The towers, which form the main vertical elements to the original design, were as important as the plan, which was based on the golden section. The present plan is to rebuild the towers in such a way as to evoke the original flavour of the pleasure gardens rather than try to recreate the original design. This is probably late 1980s, early 90s restoration. I'm not quite sure what will happen to this under the present HLF restoration. Thank you very much, Ted. It should be gin for the voice, shouldn't it, really?
You can have it if you like.
Better not. To survive, some buildings have to find new uses, and palm houses and winter gardens present a particular problem. On the left is the Winter Garden of Sunderland, Mowbray Park, and on the right, Stanley Park, Liverpool. They were an additional park attraction, and many were added in the late 19th century. They provided a warm environment and somewhere to go on a wet day, and they featured exotic and unusual plants. I quote, "A breath of the Orient is imparted, and the visitor is transported, as it were, into a fairyland of graceful palms, orange, cotton, and banana trees, and subtropical plants in profusion. Many of them are now being restored, but in order for them to survive economically and to ensure that they do not subsequently fall victim to vandalism, the proposed new uses often involve major intervention into the interior and or extensions to the building." This is Tollcross Park in the East End of Glasgow, created out of the grounds of this magnificent Scottish baronial mansion. In 1879 it became a public park, and this is a burn going through the grounds. The winter gardens in Tollcross Park, in their original state in about 1993, have now been restored, as you can see on the right, and extended at the rear as a cafe restaurant which also provides training for catering students. When I phoned up to borrow slides for this lecture, I was surprised that they didn't show me the extension. What can you tell from that? At any rate, there is still generous planting in the interior. The stables and outbuildings that you see on the left have been converted into a visitor centre and education facility. And the restoration has also included moving avenues back to their correct line. Perhaps the best known of the later conservatories is the Palm House in Sefton Park, Liverpool, donated by Henry Yates Thompson in 1896, manufactured by Mackenzie and Moncur. Intended to delight the eye, interest the student, and generally make life brighter. Nothing wrong with that. And it was planted by James Veitch and Son, which you see on the right-hand side, the original planting. It's the most significant building within the park, the focus of important vistas, and it also has wonderful wrought iron gates. There was a low hedge around it, and the dome of the Palm House could be seen from afar. This is it in its very declined state. It is now being restored and will become a restaurant. This is the first stage of stabilization. There's no glass at all in the top of the building. In this new restoration, the base has been tunnelled underneath to provide a separate entrance for the restaurant and toilets. And the building will, and I quote, become function-orientated. That is, you can hire it. Whether you can just drop by for a cup of coffee, I'm not sure. The statues which surrounded the building will be brought back, but, it's a big but too, to ensure security, a 4-metre high metal fence around the building has been installed and will be retained. However, this is presented as a positive step. It will be planted around, but of course, of such a scale of planting, and I imagine cypresses, but maybe I'm wrong. But of course, this planting will also hide the palm house when it goes up. So with the new hedge, the relationship between the palm house and the park will go. While we're still in Sefton Park, I had to show you these delightful boathouses and shelters around the lake before they were boarded up, which they have been for at least 10 years. But the council decided, nevertheless, to reinstate boating on the lake. Good idea. However, in order to store the boats, a large container has been placed alongside the lake. A practical solution, but hardly a sensitive addition to this wonderful landscape. Newsham Park and Stanley Park in Liverpool are also in difficulties. In Newsham Park, the black tarmac has been replaced by red, and according to one source, it's become such a design nightmare that approval in principle has been withdrawn by the HLF. Approval for the restoration of Stanley Park was nearing signing when it was proposed to move a football club into the park, and this restoration is now on hold. I've already mentioned a few examples of new park buildings, such as the playground and visitor centre in People's Park, Halifax. In Sunderland, the restoration of Mowbray Park is part of the overall regeneration of the city centre. This has involved the reinstatement of lost features, such as the bandstand, which I show you on the left, remodeling the lake and improving the rockery edging, constructing a new playground on the theme of Alice Through the Looking Glass, and the construction of new winter gardens. These are the old winter gardens which were bombed during World War II, and a library built on its footprint. The new winter gardens have been built on one end of the original building, overlooking the lake. It's a temperate house, which contains palms, exotic plants, floral displays, and tropical birds. Lister Park in Bradford is another park which was in a very declined state. The bandstand has only the plinth and lower wall remained. This is the bandstand in its heyday on the left, and this has now been reinstated. A new boathouse has been built, as you see on the left-hand screen, and a new play area. The park is in the centre of a large Asian community and is the focus for the popular annual Bradford Mela. Its most exciting new feature is the Mughal Garden, designed by Chris Shepherd and Bradford Design Unit. This is located on what was a derelict plot on the edge of the park, behind the art gallery and museum that you can see on the right-hand screen. So it doesn't conflict with the historic landscape. Its design is based on principles that influence the original Mughal gardens in order to create a design that is appropriate to the site conditions, the local community, the project finances, local climate, and available materials. And this is, you can see two views of it here. It is immensely popular. Park buildings were designed for a variety of purposes, and to survive, they must have a valid function that will work in the context of today and the future. The problems presented by preserving and restoring some of these buildings may lead to compromises, as we have seen, and the final result may be that little of the feeling of the original remains, or that the relationship between the building and its landscape is damaged. Although we may strive to ensure the accuracy of authentic details in buildings, statues, and monuments, we cannot recreate the past. We live in the 21st century. Everything we look at and experience, we do so through our 20th century minds and attitudes. We can never see our historic parks as they were originally, for they are of their time and we are of ours. We can reveal the presence of the past and perhaps some of the excitement of that presence. But our parks are not museums, and they have always accommodated change. The success of conservation and restoration depends on much more than the chimera of the pursuit of authenticity, for our understanding of the past continually changes. Historical research plays a key role, but if the conservation of park buildings and landscapes is to be viable and sustainable, then we need to understand how these parks are used today and their social and economic context. Our public parks are physically accessible to all income groups and all abilities, but this does not mean that intellectual accessibility can be assumed, and this is where interpretation and community involvement are so important. This is why the HLF has stressed the importance not just of the physical restoration of urban parks, but also of their regeneration. And this is why funding has been available not only for repair and restoration, but also for new works such as playgrounds, toilets, cafes, visitor centres, and imaginative additions like the Mughal Garden in Lister Park. Thank you.
Well done, Hazel. Well done. Now, to bring many threads of this conference together, we've got Stuart Harding on getting it together. Is Stuart here? He is. Isn't that splendid? So, will you now thread together the pearls that we have received and present it to us as a finished necklace? Or something like that.
Thank you, Ted. The answer to that is no,
Well, you just get to
because I think that's your job later on in the afternoon.
Yeah, I'm going to refuse that too.
I don't like all these microphones, actually. It feels like a bit of a rock concert. If I shout, can people... Hello, Jennifer. Can you hear me? Yes, you can wait. Does anyone mind? Can you hear me all right if I talk like this, even though I've got a polo in my mouth? Everyone happy with that? Because I find that...
There's a microphone.
There's another lot over here. Can you hear me all right? I find the microphone a bit distancing, so if you don't mind, I will do it my way. It was great hearing Hazel talking about some of this. I'll have to get rid of this. Does anyone want it? No, I can't get rid of it. There's no dim.
Crunch it up.
Mint flavoured raisin. It was great hearing Hazel's. I mean, Hazel's been great with the HLF program because it was Hazel's book that drew everyone's attention to public parks. And some of the slides were great because I ran the parks program for 4 years, and all of the schemes that she talked about I was familiar with. But of course, in the nature of jobs like that, there was a lot of pressure in that job, and the pressure was about getting grants through, getting grants out to people. So I never actually saw any of the finished product. I mean, it's great to see the slides. I didn't know the Mughal Garden Lister Park had been finished. It's fantastic. So it's worth coming for that alone. But what I want to talk about today is I thought I was going to be in the graveyard slot after lunch. And I also thought there was going to be wine on the menu. So I thought it would be like that. So I thought I wouldn't be too demanding on you. But the major point that I think I want to make, but it could change as I go along, is that expertise, and this conference has been about expertise, it's been about detailing, getting it right. Now that is something that we're all in pursuit of. But I think the point I want to make is that expertise is only one element in getting a successful scheme together, and expertise is only ever as good as the ability of a project team to actually deliver it in the job. So this is a bit of a departure for me, because my usual job in speaking to people is to rabble-rouse and to get people's enthusiasm for something. Today, because it's a weekend, when Ted booked me, he didn't tell me it's a Saturday, it's going in day. Thoughts a bit booth. So I thought I'd actually indulge myself in the luxury of being a bit negative today, but only slightly, as you'll see. And I want to talk about the things that can go wrong. That on the one hand, I mean, there's been a tremendous upsurge in knowledge about park restoration, the work of the GHS. There's all sorts of experts. I'm a bit daunted because I read the list of people attending, and you know, there's a lot of expertise around. Now, being a bureaucrat and having been one for 10 years, having been involved in park and garden restoration for 15 years, I know that there is a hell of a way to travel between somebody doing a very detailed thesis on the nature of cast iron bench ends to actually getting a project on the ground that everyone can be proud of. So we're all kind of going in the same direction, but I thought I'd tell you about some of the things that could go wrong. Now, don't let me give the wrong impression, because I think I've been involved directly with probably over 300 park and garden restoration projects in one way or another. And I have actually been on the sharp end. I've been on the end where you're doing the design, you are raising the funds, you are getting planning permission, and all the rest of it. I've been from there to the other extreme, running the parks programme, where suddenly you're dishing out grants of 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 million. I mean, this, 10 years ago, who would have ever dreamt that Battersea Park would get £7 million? And before I go on, there is one thing. I mean, there are some very influential people in this audience, and I recently spoke at the National Trust Conference on gardens. £200 million of lottery money has gone into public parks over the last 4 or 5 years. And somehow or other, I'm not sure how, but it seems to have passed us all by. Now, at the National Trust Conference, the Trust were banging on about how they're custodians of 200 of our most important historic design landscapes. Fine. And they were very keen that the sort of magnitude of the task was appreciated by people. Well, alongside that, in 4 or 5 years, the Heritage Lottery Fund has supported more than 200 historic parks and gardens. Now, to me, and people always shoot me down for this, but to me there is an issue here for society at large, that somehow or other the consensus that existed in Victorian society and extended right through the 20th century, which supported public parks, and it all came from Ruskin, the idea that good landscapes are morally uplifting and all the rest of it, seems to have been forgotten. And it's only been forgotten in recent years, maybe since the 70s. And this huge effort on public parks has been largely unrecorded. And my plea to anyone here who's got any influence is publicise. Publicise what's going on. We're talking, Hazel pointed to it, it's economic regeneration, it's social inclusion. I mean, we all know that parks and gardens actually stitch people together. That this is the thing. Everyone loves gardens. Everyone exposed to gardens. Everyone who's got a garden absolutely loves them. I'm on a spiritual quest. Gardens are the way that we sew society back together. Now, if the great achievements of the Urban Parks Programme are not actually recorded and not reported, then, this whole effort is going to be in vain. We've got a government task force right now which is looking at the future of urban parks. And the case for doing historic restoration, albeit with knocks on, so that you do a new glass house at Mowbray Park instead of recreating the old one. The whole case for an historic approach to restoration of public parks has not really been won. It was won within the HLF because that's a heritage body. But the task force could well come up with completely different solutions. And if you're a government minister and it's drawn to your attention that there's maybe a 1 to 4 billion backlog in terms of necessary repairs and renovations needed to public parks, but there is an alternative scenario which says, for example, that let's turn our urban parks into countryside and towns. Let's forget the monuments, let's forget the expensive items, let's forget the glass houses, let's plant lots of native trees and have an education programme and photo opportunities and the rest of it. Now there's room for that in the urban area, but let's, for God's sake, value the historic importance of this tremendous legacy. I mean, Hazel's slides were great. Parks used to be fantastic. Gardens in their own right. They were Stowe and Stourhead and all the rest of it made for the public. Birkenhead Park was all those brilliant design. Paxton's fantastic designer. Designed a marsh into a landscape, Let's hang on to that. Let's publicise it. Let's say this is worth keeping. Okay, rant over. That's not actually, I didn't intend to say any of that.
Well, it's brilliant.
It's amazing.
Well, it's brilliant.
What a public house is aligned with it. way in which expertise actually integrates with getting a project going and getting a project successfully completed. And this says philosophy of restoration. Now, detail is fine, but detail depends on where your philosophy is. Well, nearly all of our landscapes have got overlays from different periods, so immediately you're into the philosophical inquiry about which period is best. Do we want all of them? Do we, you know, in the 15 years I've been involved in garden restoration, I've seen the base philosophy change so many times. When I first came into it, it was always restored back to the last significant design, which was always interpreted as, all right, you go back to Brown and Repton and Paxton and so on. And then it was kind of realised that this, if you did restore strictly to those early designs, that you were then in danger of losing very valuable overlays. So then it was restored back to the last significant design, whoever did it. Well, you know, you can see the subjectiveness creeping in already. You know, who decides what's significant? And then it was, excuse me, and then it moved on to restore as found, which, you know, got some advantages, but what it meant was that you were actually hanging on to an awful lot of really poor landscape design. Okay, you see my subjective creeping in there. So that has never really been sorted out, and I think after all the years of experience, I think the view I can come to is one that I borrowed from the I Ching. It's the idea of properness, what's right. And again, maybe a subjective view, but I think now that the way we approach restoration schemes is there's so many people involved in it, so many people have got ideas about different aspects of the design and the rest of it, that actually the process of arguing the toss over every aspect actually gets you to a point where you end up doing, by and large, what's right, so that the original design intentions, the structural intentions can be kept, the view lines, the things which knit a landscape together, the groups of woodland, the grass that links them, the idea of different landscape cells within the design, the ideas of safety, enjoyment, all the rest of it. Actually, the process of delay can get you to where you can be fairly confident that what you're taking away needs to be taken away and what's preserved needs to be preserved, and what goes in that to you deserves to go in. Now, you know, 40 years' time somebody's going to disagree with that, but, you know, let's not get paralysed by our own philosophical inquiries. Search point one. There's only got another 57 to go. I'll be quick on this. Expertise is also has a part in a hierarchy of interests and priorities. Now, the urban parks program, of course, has been in by and large with local authority owners who've got a whole range of priorities, and restoring to some concept of an original design is a difficult one to push into the process, and it's really hard work. I mean, I'm okay because I've been around long enough to know that the historic designers, right through to Paxton and beyond, were actually really good at what they did. So I'm always confident in recommending that you explore the historic design and work out how it worked on the ground. And most of your problems will be answered. The local authorities think apart, you know, I mean, before the Urban Parks Programme, local authorities did not think of their parks as historic landscapes or heritage assets in any way. They were a leisure service provision. In fact, that whole thinking has led to a lot of problems for parks. But so it was quite hard to get in the idea that the original design actually also was leisure service provision, but with the added ingredient that somehow the way the landscape worked was capable of uplifting your soul and giving you spiritual enlightenment, as well as being able to have a game of golf, or as well as being able to paddle. It was all these things plus. So that's number two. Abilities. I can't actually remember why I put this down, but I think what I meant was there is a process that expertise is at one end of the process, that somebody pays for the expertise. Let's work out the appropriate historic planting scheme. Let's work out the detail of the railings. Let's work out all the ins and outs and how this part works. But the expertise is often at several steps removed from the final product, because that goes into the mill, and then there's the grant applications, the grant assessment, there's the advice on the assessment, there is then you go back to the local authority, there is then the working up the detailed drawings and plans and all the rest of it, and then there is the cost, and so on and so on. So, the expertise goes in there. What comes out the other end can be a very different animal. And it does depend a lot on the abilities of the people who are in those key posts on the way towards the final product. And that's bureaucrats, but it's also local authority officers, it's also even junior staff within consultancies and so on and so on. So there's a lot of places there where the process can go wrong. There's also the idea of make and do for now. One of the things that the Urban Parks programme was really bedeviled with was actually when it came to cost study that needed to be done to most of our parks, it was hugely, frighteningly, terrifyingly expensive. And so there is a natural urge on the part of applicants, consultants and the HLF to try and draw back from that. So we actually end up, I would say probably 90% of the schemes funded under the Urban Parks programme were undercosted and underfunded. And there was actually a conspiracy of the people involved not to try and overegg this thing. There's also a problem with willful disobedience. And some of the examples I think we might show that. There is also bad luck. Bad luck plays a part in this in getting the project on the ground. There's also the question of timing. It's when the expertise, at which point in the process the expertise comes in, because if it comes in too late in the process, expertise normally demands more money. And it could be that the amount of money for a project has already been decided before the implications of the expertise comes in. There's the question of monitoring, that if you apply expertise and you come up with a really good scheme, somebody has got to ensure that it's actually carried out well. And that means, firstly, the details of the scheme need to be adequately reviewed. Now, on the £5 million urban park scheme, the drawings that you will get as a monitor, I know some people do a vacuum left monitor, you might get a stack of drawings which are that high. And you're being paid by HLF to review them, but they're not paying you to actually go and visit the site or talk to anybody. They're sending you a bunch of drawings which you need to look at, and you open them out on your kitchen floor or your dining room floor, and they will actually take up the whole of this room. So that's an expensive business, and it's also a business which is fraught with peril, because it's extremely difficult to do as a purely desk exercise. It's a hard job. If it's a planting scheme, it actually presupposes that you know the names of all these plants, and you know their habits, and you know the way they're going to look together. I mean, this is daunting stuff. So there's another area where things can go badly wrong. So I'll get onto some examples, and this goes right back from the Urban Parks programme. I was first involved as a voluntary conservationist with the Avon Gardens Trust, trying to defend Stoke Park in Bristol, Thomas Wright landscape, which was up for wholesale development. And I worked with David Lambert a lot on sort of planning issues, and we were really gung-ho on the planning. And one of the places we saved from wholesale development was the capability ground landscape just outside Bath, Kelston Park. And it was actually up for grabs. Local authorities are all the time under pressure to provide land for housing, and that's going to increase over the next few years. So they look at their maps like anybody else, a nice big open space. They see a derelict landscape with derelict buildings in it. So that seemed like, well, there's potential there. So Dave and I spent probably 2.5 years fighting off development aspirations on Kelston Park, and we finally achieved it. And because we achieved that, the house and park was sold as one unit to the owner of Hallmark Cars, which I don't know whether that's good or bad, but it didn't mean it kept the thing intact. Now we've been fighting that battle for a long time, and then Johnny Phibbs, who's a brilliant landscape historian and designer, became involved in what's going to happen to the park under a countryside stewardship scheme. Johnny quite privately said to David and I, well, of course, that's all right, Kelson Park, but the real deal with Kelson Park was Capability Brown's ride, which extended for miles around this landscape. And so that's a job as an academic was the most important thing, and without those, Kelson Park wasn't worth the life. So what? I don't know, who'd been fighting the wrong battle? I don't know, but there's expertise. And there was no way of actually achieving it. So that was the first thing that I remember that made me think, okay, being a lobbyist for parks actually might not be enough. There are other issues going on here. You know, you can't actually restore Capability Brown's intention to Kelson Park. You can restore the park, but you can't restore the rides from which it was supposed to be viewed. Step one. Step two, I worked for Task Force Trees, which was a unit of the Countryside Commission set up to administer storm damage grants after the 1987 and 1980 storms. And the idea of those grants was to replace trees which had been felled. In the southwest, for example, we lost over 1 million trees in one night. So, you know, a lot of work to be done. And the first principles with that scheme were to clear away the debris and replant the trees that have come down, which is the kind of obvious thing to do. And very quickly, I mean, Jennifer White at the back there had more experience with the 1987 storms in the southeast, and so there was a kind of a technique being developed. One of our first sites was Powderham Castle in Devon. And we'd introduced the idea of, okay, we don't just replace them, let's do a little bit of historic research so that we know what we're doing. Well, Powderham Devon, on the 1885 first edition 25-inch Ordnance Survey map, quite clearly showed along this meandering drive going at Powderham Castle was an avenue of cedars either side. And on site, there were these cedars, 90% were blown over, mature trees, absolutely devastated. So, a lot of money was spent clearing those away, planting new ones, quite big, you know, heavy standing trees with guards around all the way down this avenue. And then the scheme kind of became more refined and we moved on, and we started insisting on full-blown historic landscape restoration plans. And we got some good consultants in, and they looked at the history of the Powderham landscape, and they discovered that this was actually a brilliant example of kind of Regency design of landscape. The castle had all been done up in that kind of pseudo-Gothic style, and the landscape was brilliant. And what the last thing you wanted down the meandering drive, which cut through this, was an avenue of cedar trees. So who got the job of going to see Lord Courtney and saying, how about those cedars? And we paid him to take them all out again. He said, Countryside Commission, bloody idiot. But we were actually doing our best. And when they were cleared away, you could see that it was absolutely right that drive was made to meander through an open landscape. And these cedars that have been there for more than 100 years had actually divided that landscape in two quite arbitrarily with no good purpose. And as an aside, I've always felt, and I always argued, that an avenue should be straight. To me, the whole point of an avenue is that you can see from one end to the other. But actually, the dictionary doesn't say that. So, and I argue like mad that an avenue should always be straight, but apparently they're not. I can't see the point, but they've got a bend in this point. But we had similar examples when I came into the job in Swindon, in a Georgian landscape called Lawn Park, Georgian with Victorian overlays. There was a drive, and it's become a public park. And this drive had also been devastated by the storms, but it had actually been dominated by holm oak and evergreen shrubberies, which had grown in so close that it was a tunnel. And it was a 150-yard tunnel to get into the park. And it actually was quite scary and daunting. You know, it was dark, and there was the whole idea that people could leap out of it. Chance would be a fine thing. So Swindon decided, okay, they swept all this away, cleared it all out, and actually when you do that, it's like when you get rid of crap furniture in the house, suddenly you've got this huge area. And they decided, they'd elected to plant pin oaks in there. Now, you know, I mean, not all of us know everything, do we? And so pin oaks, okay, this scheme already been approved. If I looked at it in my observe a book of trees, you know, you do. And pin oaks actually like moist, marshy conditions. They like a lot of water to grow, to thrive. And I thought, well, hang on, Lawn Park is in Swindon Old Town, right at the top of the hill, on this weird rock that's called Coral Rag, which drains like that. So I went back and I said, look, I'm not convinced, you know, I think you might have a problem here. But they'd already ordered the trees, £1,000 ago for me to do, and he said, we're not worried because in the contract is 5 years after care to water the trees and look after them and so on. Well, I went back to Swindon last week, and this is 6 or 7 years old from those trees being planted, and they're all dead. I mean, it's very sad because they did actually look really good for 2 or 3 years. But there's also now a plaque there which says these trees planted by Task Force Trees Countryside Commission. How embarrassing. So there's expertise and expertise. Now, the point about the lawn park trees is that that was the existing expertise that the arboriculturists in Swindon Council, who were qualified people, had actually elected to go for those trees. And they'd gone on the basis of, like, these weren't going to close in as a canopy, that they had good autumn colour, that they were very open and all the rest. So that's the kind of expertise. The expertise they had missing, actually, was the idea that this thing had ever been an avenue. It wasn't. It was a shrub-lined drive, but they never quite got that because trees had grown up in it and seen it as an avenue. And it was strange. So a bit later on, when I was doing the Urban Parks programme, I had occasion to go to Llandudno in North Wales to look at various schemes we had there. And it's a fantastically beautiful place. I mean, I don't know how many of you know it, but there is a coast either side of Llandudno, which makes it quite unusual. There are beaches either side, great town. And the only thing that I found there which jarred was a horrible kind of continental style zebra crossing, which had continental style railings. You know those horrible railings with little circles in? No? Somebody, is there anyone out there? Does anybody know these railings of which I speak? Some people know. Accompanied by plastic pollution beacons. And I thought, God, how did this happen? These people are just so stupid to do something like that in such a graceful town. And then I saw the plaque funded by HLF Urban Parks Programme. Right. So we were so stupid. So I went to see them, and they said, what's the problem? And I said, well, it's hardly heritage, is it? I don't know what we're doing funding zebra crossings anyway. The bid came into us to fund, I think it's Happy Valley and Hawthorne Gardens in Llandudno, which were, you know, and also to do some linking stuff in between, because at that time we had loads of money and lots of ideas we would do everything. So this was part of the scheme, and I said, well, it sort of really jars with the historic figure of the town. He says, what's historic got to do with it? And I said, well, you know, you came into the Heritage Lottery Fund to do heritage. Well, you never said it was historic. So we had a scheme that we put to the Welsh Development Board that they rejected, so we sent it to you. So I said, what, you mean it was never intended to be historic? No. So that's why I say about ability, see, because we were running that scheme. I mean, the whole movement of historic parks and gardens is not over and down with experts or practitioners. You know, where do you get... We funded hundreds of posts for the park managers. We wanted to bring staff back into parks. And people are advertising for these staff posts. Well, where do you get them from? Where is the whole continuity of understanding of historic parks is gone? So who do you get in? Well, we're the same in HLF. We needed grant officers, and you get in people who appear to know how to administer grants. But you're not getting in experts on historic parks. So somehow or other, this particular officer missed the fact that this was not actually an application to do historic park restoration. It was actually, if you like, a kind of highway scheme. So problems there. We were very fortunate because we actually appointed a consultancy to monitor the project, which did know about historic restoration, went in there and started working on them and saying, but you know, at that stage, a monitor doesn't have any particular hold on them. They got the money for the scheme that they put in, and the monitor has to do all schemes that have been kicking around for a while, and we're going to resubmit them to us, because you can't blame people. Local authorities are always on the lookout for funding, and they don't much care where the funding comes from. So if the funding comes from a body which I shall make up, which is called the Organisation for New Crap Design in Parks. Ooh, I like that. Because the parks have been starved of capital investment for 20, 25 years. And it's been a disaster for them. So the parks are ready to jump on anything. And there are some parks which benefited from SRB funding. And there's a famous one, Pallister Park in Middlesbrough. Only you go up there, have a look at it. It was all new money for all new design. And it was heralded as the leisure centre without a roof. And it actually looks like that. And Pallister Park wasn't particularly a great historic design, but it was a nice design from the 20s and 30s. And all the possibilities and potential for historic restoration was just overlooked. It was all bang, new design. And I don't know, is it good? I don't know. It's kind of bright and garish, and it's very popular. And it's very popular because part of the SRB funding was actually there are 10 people in post there on site looking after your kids, showing what to do, having fun and all the rest of it. That funding will taper off, and I wonder what the future for that park will be when the funding goes, because the big issue for parks is that most parks you go into do not have anybody on site at all. You have contractors who fly in and fly out again, but there's actually no presence. So there was willful misunderstanding of heritage. I mean, some people rebadge their schemes so that things like, there's one application I was looking at which kept referring to a linear historic feature, and I kept flipping through and I couldn't think, what the hell is this? I looked at the maps, nothing, it kept referring to it over and over again. And I still didn't get it. And I said, you want 750,000 for this historic linear feature? I'm quite familiar with plans of parks. And I was expecting some canal or cursor, it was a road. It was the Park Drive, which was a linear historic feature. And then lots of other ones came in where the designing was a lot of you must read landscape design magazine and similar magazines where people advertise. I mean, I was bombarded with this stuff. New design for landscape stuff. Now, I don't know, call me old-fashioned. I'm gonna hand something around. This is just a few little pictures. If you just have a look and sort of like spread it around. I would like them back, actually, please. Right, we had schemes. Now, people are constrained by money, and they're constrained by taste. Give me one of those back. They're barricading me over here. I forgot the groupies at the start. Make sure those get round to them. Right, now, so what you get is a determination. I've met some very bullish landscape designers who produced a new scheme which went into the Millennium Commission for a grant and was actually turned down. Millennium Commission wasn't great on funding parks, and thank God for that, because the scheme they put in on the park not too far away, Battersea Park, it had its high points, but it majored on new design for furniture and features within parks. It took a very, very modern approach. Now, my view of things like benches, lampposts and the rest of it is that what we've had in the past is a kind of thread of continuity and then an evolution in design. Because that continuity broke down at some point, what we get now from landscape designers is new stuff, and it's thought up stuff. It doesn't connect with what went before. It's some smarts at a drawing board working out what to do. And the net result is Two. Three if you're lucky. Two. Sometimes one. Right? And why is this? It's because somebody's trying to make a design departure. And what we end up with that is the same as we've got on our railway stations. Now, if say you were a designer of benches who was very antisocial and actually hated the human race, despised them, actually despised people who were foolish enough to get to a station and have to actually wait for a train, which sometimes is not in your control, is it? What you'd actually design for our climate is sheet metal for the seat to freeze your bum. And then just in case that didn't freeze you enough, you drill loads of little holes in it. So you get my drift. So one of the projects I'm involved in, Forbury Gardens at Reading, we were very interested. We put in some money in the bid for resupplying benches, and the design they've got right now is a very functional kind of borough council kind of deal, you know, which is fairly sturdy but very plain in its design and rather dull, rather boring, rather metropolitan, rather it's got them little circles in it actually, like railings. I don't know, somebody's making a fortune out of it. Somebody got this thing with these double bars and a little circle in it. And so I said, don't go for those, but if you can't afford 40 good quality benches, let's shift the money so that we buy 10, and your renewal program, when you go to get it, will actually go to a good, because otherwise you're stuck with this crap design forever. So we thought, okay, fine, let's do some more research. So we dug out all the old postcards, didn't we? 25 old postcards with magnifying glass. And the unfortunate thing was, it became perfectly clear that Forbury Gardens in Reading never had any benches ever. What they did was get the deck chairs out from under the bandstand and hire them to people, which actually is due for a comeback, I must say. So there's an issue there. Now, everyone, whether they realise it or not, has been really influenced by the SPAC sort of idea that, okay, Forbury Gardens never had any old benches, so we need some new ones, so let's go for good new design. Now, the reason I pass those pieces of paper around is that why do we always, with landscape parks, always think it's got to be good new design? Why not good old design? Good design is good design. I had a great quote last night on the radio. Louis Armstrong said, there are only two kinds of music, good music and bad music. Right? Well, to me, there's only two kinds of benches, good benches and bad benches. Now, these benches, which you're looking at, except for you lot, of course, you haven't got the pictures. Someone make sure they get them, preferably the coloured ones, so I don't think they're going to attack me. Good benches which have been tested over time are actually vandal-proof. I mean, you wouldn't think it, would you? Those thin, slatted benches. But, you know, in my past, in one of my former lives, I was a bit of a hooligan. And I know that it's much easier to put your boot through a single solid slab than loads of thin slabs, which, sorry, no, they're not. But I was. I understand. So anyway, these are good benches. Do you know how much these cost? Did anyone spot the ones with the serpent? 375 quid. Not bad. Those other ones, those municipal ones with the little serpent, about £600 for 5 quid. So, you know, it's out there, the expertise is there. Let's use it. Right, where was it? That was another departure, I didn't say that either. Okay, health and safety gone mad, right? That was the deal. Handrails everywhere, and there are real issues with this. That anyone ever go to Simpsons in Piccadilly Waterstones now? They've got little signs up on the wall that says, "Your advice to take care as this handrail may be lower than you expected." So we've obviously got bigger as a right. It's preschool milk, but one thing that obviously hasn't got bigger is our heads, because railings now, historic railings, are regarded that the gaps between them are too wide, and children will go wonderful historic railings, and you want to replicate them because this is a big issue for parks. Most of the railings taken away from the war effort. You know where they went, don't you? You all know where they went. They went into the North Sea because it was actually not economical to recycle. Where did they go? North Sea. I don't know the exact location. Are you a diver? I do think there's a bit of a niche there for an So it means that if you're copying original designs, you can't copy them because health and safety rules won't let you copy them unless that gap is less than 100 millimetres. But of course, when the original range was designed, millimetres didn't exist, did they? Not for us. They existed across the water, but not for us. And so that creates issues, and it's can be quite difficult to overcome because if you scale down, you actually change the whole kind of feeling of the things, and it's a kind of expensive thing to do as well. And you will also find lots of railings where there's the old railing, and then there's an extra 4 inches on top, usually in some sort of galvanised steel with very unsympathetic design. So these are unexpected things. The expertise comes in, these railings are fantastic, replicate them, put them there, everything's fine, let's all go away. And then some poor project manager has to come to terms with this. There are new costs involved. Maybe the costs are not built into the programme, so what do you do then? You're stuck. You don't have the money to do it. You've got a certain amount of money, so what you start looking at cheaper materials, or you start looking at grabbing money from some other part of the project to put into this. This is the reality of actually getting these schemes into operation. Same goes for spikes on top of railings. I mean, I have personally broken into parks after dark many times in my life, in the firm knowledge that should I be foolish enough to fall out of a tree and spike myself on the railings, it's my own fault. But we're not allowed to have our own fault anymore, and so you're not allowed to have spikes. You have to do something to the spike. Another one, Wellington Park in Somerset, fabulous little park, really great little historic park, fabulous restoration plan done by Colston Stone, really brilliant, project going swimmingly, all the expertise was there, and some adventurous child managed to pitch themselves headlong onto the ha-ha, which I suppose with a ha-ha is understandable, isn't it? But there is now going to be a court case which is about the responsibility of the local authority to announce the danger of pitching headlong off a harbour. And this could have, seriously, this could have real ramifications for all kinds of historic restorations, because if they find that that is a bona fide danger, it means that every harbour is going to have a fence above it, or something, I don't know, or a notice, or so we've gone from Kent leaping, what is it? Somebody was saying, leaping the garden fence or whatever it was. Yeah, of course. So we got now you can't, there's going to be a fence there. So serious stuff, that is. Also at Wellington Park, there was restoration of the pathways, and a great scheme, get the right stone, resin bonded, going to last for years, look very good, fantastic job done. And the experts have gone to a lot of trouble to identify the right stone from the local quarry, get the right colour and the right consistency and the rest of it. It was done very well, and nobody had any complaints about it. As luck, this is where bad luck comes in, as luck would have it, this particular seam in this quarry turned out to be really, really soft stone. And it was all broken up underwear. Now, normally you'd think, okay, there's contractor's liability, but the contractor actually did the job perfectly well. Supplying what they said they would supply. The contractor's since gone bust, I understand. So you've now got, in the middle of a brand new restoration scheme, the parts which are breaking up and looking awful. It look awful. It does look awful. So another unforeseen circumstance. Dominic Cole told me that at Rest Park they were going to do something really radical, not just recreate the design, but they were actually going to recreate the methodology of Batty Langley. And what they did, when they planted trees, they planted whips, which are generally about that tall, most of your trees. And then they underplanted these little plugs, which are just germinating trees. And there, did all this, planted all this stuff, and then the idea was, putting back in language, that they didn't have weed killer. Well, they might have some terrible concoction of arsenic probably, but the idea was that they would keep the grasses down so that the trees could flourish, because they weren't going to hand weed them. And they never got round to it, so eventually the grasses got up like that, so it was just the top of the whip showing, and the same contractors who planted all this stuff went and trimmed them off. Clearly forgot. Dominic's a funny man, actually. He told me also that he's working on the site. Now that we've won, do you know that? We've actually won. This idea of like historic replanting in a private estate, we've won that. I'm not sure about the public parts, but the private estate's fine, we've won. And Dominic has a lot of work for private individuals who've got historic landscapes. And people now getting obsessed about historically authentic and accurate trees. So there was one thing where Dominic was doing the planting plans and all that, and the owner was saying that these historically correct, these trees. And Dominic said, yeah. And he said, well, are you sure they're historically correct? And I'm really worried about not getting the historically correct trees. And Dominic didn't really understand what he was about, and he said, but these are the trees. These actually are the trees. They're not only historically correct, these are the trees that were there on the historic design. And so, I mean, great, that's lovely. If we're all going to go that far beyond, what's reasonable, that's excellent. If people are worried about having historically correct trees and they've actually got the historic trees themselves, I think that's good. I think we've made some mileage. 2 good points. How am I going?
Perfect.
Perfect, thank you. Bad luck. The HLS schemes restore Southwark Park. They drain the lake and dump some dead bodies in it. You can imagine how that slows down your time. And the last thing I want to say, that probably in the Architectural Association, probably not the right place to say. There's a booklet downstairs in Cell which it's got a byline which says deviations from normality or something like that. And I thought, yeah, I felt like that loads of times. Architects should not design buildings in public parks until they understand what public parks are about. We had a Battersea Park, £7 million, and there's loads of money to do the right thing. And one of the things that had gone missing was a boathouse. Now, I hope some of you know Battersea Park. There's a really key bit of the design where there is a cafe on one bank and opposite is a waterfall. And it's fabulous that, I think it was Paxton and others who designed it, but you've actually got perfect alpine scenery in Battersea Park, which was constructed on a stinking marsh. I mean, this was how good they were. And it's fantastically convincing. And one of the things that was put in to embellish the scene was a boathouse. And the original boathouse had kind of, I mean, let's remember, parks are fun. Parks are like seasides. You don't have to be curious about it. They are fun places. And the original boathouse was an alpine, I don't know, like cooking clock actually, but it kind of fitted in. And so this had gone, and they got an architect to come in and look at this. Well, in the old days, when we had the cooking clock, the boats used to actually sail in, I suppose, roughly the place where the cooking would have come out. They'd sail in there, and then they'd be hauled up. Right. But they don't use those kind of boats anymore. They use fiberglass things, so you can just haul them out. And in fact, the function, see, architects love this, function over form, don't they? Or function dictates form, or something like that. I don't know why. Why does it? Why does function have to dictate form? Otherwise it doesn't work. Function should be part of form, certainly. But do you remember, anyone remember in the 20s the beautification committees? Local councils used to have a thing called the beautification committee. Anyway, function dictates form. So what he designed for us was a concrete bunker, which was it was like a garage on a poorly designed house. Concrete bunker. And we said, well, it's a bit crap, isn't it? I mean, it hasn't got much sense with shoes in, if you lift the lid and turn it at a slight angle so it doesn't fit anymore, and it's slightly off. that was it. I don't want to say anything else about that. But the one thing which came up over and over and over again, any of you who've read Repton with his hints and tips and hints and all that. Repton's greatest thing when he was ever asked to place a building anywhere, particularly the main house, was its orientation to the weather and the sun, and all the rest of it. And I couldn't bear to tell you how many really worked out schemes we've had in, and we were very keen to fund new cafes and places where people could sit, their kids could play home, they could enjoy the whole thing, toilets in there, everything you would need to be in a civilised society. And almost every time there was the cafe and then the terrace for sitting out on to enjoy a drink, north facing. Unbelievable, you know. And so maybe the AA should have a course for architects to design parts of vernacular buildings. How about it, Ted?
I hate to think what they look like.
Well, see, the trouble is that this constitute has gone on so long, there is no part vernacular anymore. If people won't do, like these benches